Dispersion of a Pathogen, of tremendous potency and consequences. By the counterintuitive. The following story is a social history of a grassroots psychoactive, an entity and a pathogen of tremendous potency and consequences, a drug which altered the minds of the colonizers as well as the colonized, the farmers and the carriers, the buyers and the sellers, the borrowers and lenders, the banks and the maritime cartels. Cities across nations, China, India, Britain, and America, are inextricably connected over time and events through fields of poppy, dockyards of opium, imperial maritime routes, leading to war and invasion, inflicting mass addiction via gangster capitalism, for well over 3 centuries now. An account of human and non-human entities engaged in biopolitical exchange of power and wealth under a transcontinental lens. The trade and use of opium is centuries in the making, but as an addictive pathogen it set off detonator landscapes, feral atlas, mid-18th century onward. Akin to gunpowder, spices, silk, and gold, opium too was crucial to empires as well as a precursor to global afflictions. More potent than tea, coffee, marijuana, and chocolate, it was opium and the involved nations that reveal a tapestry of intentions and consequences. Opium can be seen as a biological imperial agent, Smoke and Ashes by Amitabha Ghosh, albeit independent of nations, altering the human condition along its devastating transcontinental network. The earliest instances of opium use dates back to Central Europe and Anatolia, 3700 BCE, and later documented by Homer, Pliny, and Virgil. The Sumerians had referred to it as Hul Gil, the end quote, joy plant, end quote. 11th century Arab scholar Avicenna, Canon of Medicine, described opium as the most powerful of stupefacents. As Thomas Sydenham, 17th century English doctor, noted, among the remedies which it has pleased Almighty God to give to man to relieve his suffering, none is so universal or efficacious as opium. Simply put, opium is perhaps the oldest and most powerful medicine known to man. Today, anyone consuming pharmaceuticals would have consumed one form of opium-based compound or another. Yet, like any powerful drug, opium too escaped from its traditional and medicinal bounds transcending class, from the medicine men and the elites to the other end of the social ladder. Perso-Arabic Afian, or in Greek, opium or afim, widely used across the Indian subcontinent to later Chandu and Pajapuri, or Chinese terms like afyon and yapian, speak of a substance potent and medicinal in nature that traveled far and wide. Opium was introduced to many parts of Asia and Europe by the Mongols, 1180 to 1300 CE. Contingent to their staggering empire which stretched from China to northern India, including Iran, the Levant, Syria and Jordan, and parts of Anatolia, Turkey, and Eastern Europe, Encyclopedia Britannica. However small in quantity, by the late Middle Ages opium trade routes extended from Italy in the west to China in the east through Turkey and Germany in the north, via the Silk Route. Seafaring Arab traders introduced opium into various coastal regions of India between 1500 to 20 CE. Opium, A History by Martin Booth. Historians argue about when sustained agriculture of opium began in India and the corresponding debate over opium addiction within China. Poppy plantations grew during the second half of the Mughal Empire in northern India, dotted along the Indo-Gangetic Plain, extending into what is today Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh, then known as Malwa. The potency of opium was enhanced over time by mixing it with other psychoactives like cannabis to be consumed as a beverage or as chandu to smoke up. For centuries, the addictive power, alkaloids including morphine and heroin, did not acquire true indispensable value as a narcotic nor as a globally sought-after medicament. As with other psychoactive plants, when supplies were limited, their exposure too was slow. This afforded them time to develop social customs and usages for limiting the use of the substance, Amitabha Ghosh. Yet all that was about to change, once the plant and its pathogen was discovered by seafaring European colonizers, mid-17th century. A set of events that provided the powerful plant with a great opportunity to propel itself in outreach, demand, and addiction. Via sea, opium produced in India was primarily destined for China, which was legally acquired by the Qing dynasty. While the Qing emperors maintained steady trade relations with the newly arriving Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British, the chronic imbalance of trade did not allow the Europeans to dominate China and exploit its economy and native technologies. The French and British trading ships and several Jesuit missions attempting footfall in the Canton region faced steep challenges posed by existing Chinese laws, high tariffs, and local customs. European products and tools had little demand in the Canton. The struggle for control of the China trade E.H. Pritchard. As demand for porcelain, silk, tea, spices, rubber, rare minerals, and oriental art from China escalated in Western Europe, so did the trade imbalance between the East and the West. Opium would transform that imbalance, and how? Around 1705 CE, sensing new prospects, Portuguese vessels began to ship large quantities of opium into Chinese ports from India, enabling the substance to reach regional markets in China, Vietnam, Laos, and Macau. The Dutch East India Company followed suit, shipping Indian opium from Kerala to newly acquired ports in Java, Sumatra, Sulu, and Indonesia. While the western trajectory of opium towards Europe and America was small and dominated by British and Dutch maritime configurations, local demand within China grew steadily, outpacing supply. Over time, opium addiction and demand in southern China took on epidemic proportions. Ravaged by continuous wars with Japan, the fragmenting Qing Empire fronted by Emperor Yongzheng prohibited the sale and consumption of opium in 1730 CE. Contraband trade continued to grow regardless, over land and high seas. Ironic that the producers in India and consumers in China never connected in reality, while a host of imperial merchants, money lenders, regional labor mafias, shipping companies, and speeding maritime routes gave rise to the framework of a mighty imperial drug cartel. 100 years later, the Chinese and British would eventually go to war over the prohibition of opium and eviction of Western business concerns from China, known as the First Opium War. Vanquished by British maritime power, the Chinese were forced to concede many strategic rights in terms of territory, tariffs, and sovereignty. Control of tea and opium business was effectively taken away from the Chinese. The treaties also forced hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers into indentured labor, pouring out to South Asia, Europe, Australia, and America. As much as tea, in terms of being a prime source of revenue, opium was also effectively used to finance British colonial expansion in all directions of the earth. Merchant records from Guangzhou reveal 8,830 tons of opium that British merchants had warehoused between 1820 and 1860. The struggle for control of the China trade, E.H. Pritchard. About 100,000 chests of opium exported from India annually during 1870-80. History of the Opium Problem by Hans Dirks. A host of wealthy Indian merchants, the Parsi community, Zoroastrians of Iran, plus Baghdadis and Armenians provided labor, transport, security, and warehousing services to the British and Dutch East India Company. Parsi and Baghdadi opium traders, who were rivals, eventually merged interests to assist British bankers and Chinese merchants in setting up the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, in 1865. Hence, HSBC, a globally reputed institution of capitalism, was founded on opium wealth. Scholars also argue about the formation of Singapore as a consequence of opium wealth outflow and duty-free shipping of the drug towards America. While the British transplanted tea from China to India, in return they flooded massive amounts of Indian opium into Chinese provinces. While doing so, British merchants, travelers, and botanists also robbed Chinese expertise, labor, and, in the words of a British Governor-General, Chinese agency of tea. Arguably, a major part of the Chinese economy was pilfered and demolished through a process of technological theft initiated by the British, aided by wealthy Indians. Europeans held Chinese civilization in the highest regard, even as they were exploiting its every weakness. Smoke and Ashes by Amitava Ghosh. Early 19th century American venture capitalists and mercantile houses began to infiltrate India and China, taking on entirely new markets, no doubt as a threat to existing British domination. The entry of opium into America was an outcome of new shipbuilding technology and improved seafaring techniques. Demand for opium in Europe and China was far greater, and the Americans wanted a share of the pie. Take the case of New England colonizer Philip Delanoy Delanos, whose son Samuel Delano founded the Delano Trading Company in Guangzhou to procure, ship, and sell opium in 1795. Grandson of Samuel, Warren Delano served as the honorary consul of the United States in Guangzhou and by then boss of America's biggest opium trading company. In 1882, Warren Delano's daughter Sarah and Delano gave birth to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. the future 32nd President of USA. Families based in America which profited immensely from opium trade in Asia. Astor, Irving, Cabot, Peabody, Castillo, Archer, Coolidge, Forbes, Russell, and Perkins, to name a few. Many of them became successful entrepreneurs, plowing their opium money into many sectors of a rapidly expanding America. The colonial background of these families of privileged rank can be traced back to early European settler colonizers on the east coast of America, 1620 to 1720. Initially acquired from Turkey and later from China, prominent American opium traders would eventually seek out Indian opium via Burma, Singapore, and the Dutch Indies. By mid-1800s, opium consumption along with tobacco was common amongst thousands of railroad workers, miners, sailors, Civil War soldiers, and gold rush hunters. History of the Opium Problem by Hans Dirks. Invented in 1855 by German pharmacist Friedrich Serturner, morphine proved to be number one opiate of that age. Soon new variants like diamorphine, heroin, and isolated alkaloids like method-1 proliferated rapidly within American society during early 20th century. Morphine use on wounded soldiers during WW1 and WW2 altered the course of medical practice on both sides. Bayer from Germany introduced heroin as a clinical medicine in 1922. The impetus to expand opioid therapy and synthetic opioids surged during WW2. The Opium Business by Peter Thilley. China's early impression upon the United States was made by the wealth that American opium traders brought home. Unlike opium addiction in China, the American chapter escalated in proportion with the invention and production of new opioids. Early 1900s heroin was understood as potential solution to the increasing problem of morphine addiction. In 1905, St. James Society ran a nationwide campaign to mail free samples of heroin to morphine addicts. Bifurcated in terms of its proliferation, while on one hand drugs like morphine, heroin, crack, and methadone acquired cultural affinity, medicinal variants like hydrocodone, oxycodone, oxymorphone, morphine, codeine, and later the dreaded fentanyl spread far more rapidly across age and class as prescription drugs. While European colonizers, financiers, and merchants argued for a long time that they were merely meeting a demand, they also claimed that it was rooted in the inherent infirmities of the natives. Dutch East India Company Commission, 1810. The European deal was indeed wicked and double-edged, that if one did not provide a supply, others would. This type of denial would show up again and again like a legacy, as arguments adopted by American and European narco-states, and also by 21st century big pharma and opiate advocates. Much has been documented about the deadly contagion of legal opioids in America, Europe, and Russia. In America alone, opioids were involved in 80,411 overdose deaths in 2021, 75% of all drug overdose deaths, according to USDA. On one hand, synthetic opioids accrue immense profits for American capitalists fronted by powerful big pharma, and on the other it rolls out freeways of devastation. Just ask well-known Arthur M. Sackler, the patriarch of Purdue Pharma, the dynasty held responsible for America's 21st century opioid epidemic. You don't chase a market, you create it, says a member of the Sackler family in the TV miniseries Dopesick, which tells the story of how their company, Purdue Pharma, made billions from the painkiller OxyContin. The opioid epidemic, which has killed over 470,000 Americans in the past 2 decades, has been well documented in books like The Empire of Pain by author Patrick Keefe. The timeline between the East India Company, CIA, and Purdue Pharma is analogous as a historic process of colonization of human beings and societies via military conquest, as well as powerful addictive substances. The opioid crisis was also fueled within America thanks to the extensive involvement of the CIA expanding over decades. Inside and outside the border, narco-capitalism would evolve into dark player within the empire's economy, Patrick Keefe. Outside the America, it would rapidly collude with covert imperial wars, political sabotage, funding rebellions, and gun running, so often orchestrated by the CIA and hundreds of local hosts, based in Laos, Cambodia, and later in Nicaragua, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Was it the power of the substance or the reckless interests that created the right conditions for the passage of cheap heroin into the American market during 1970 to 1995? In this aspect, the CIA was also operating explicitly against the DEA and the so-called war on drugs. Eventually, opium trade, cocaine trafficking, regional terrorism, sabotage, and military intervention would coalesce into a blowback. Or a whole bunch of disasters that include the destruction of Afghanistan. The flames of narco-capitalism have also burned many parts of Colombia, Panama, Mexico, El Salvador, Peru, Argentina, and now threatening Venezuela. Such destruction via addiction, involving those who grow or those who sell or consume, would trigger incalculable tragedies and entanglements. The story here based on opium cannot diverge into the entanglement of the CIA, nations, and narco-capitalism. Yet thanks to some great books, check the list below, which expose the extent of narco-capitalism in our world. More crucial is the historic process vis-a-vis early colonialism, narco-capital as an inseparable part of the global economy, and the current scale of opioid crisis worldwide. What gets way more interesting, though, is the money, which ends up in various multinational banks. Argentine writer Stella Coloni comments on the matter in clear terms. Tons and tons of narcotics sold every day around the world eventually have to accrue billions of dollars for years as part of the economy, or you can call it narco-capitalism. Regardless, that money is laundered and destined for many banks. Where are those banks situated? Who is actually earning the interest? How is it invested back? A majority of the banks are based in the US, and for decades, the US administration has refused to investigate, nor have the DEA, mainstream media, narco specialists, etc., ever raised the matter in terms of numbers, accountability, even justice. No one knows what kind of money the American banks invest that is made of narco-capitalism. Why some war on drugs this is. Anti-opium movements in China, America, and India showed great promise through the 20th century. However, they did not succeed ultimately in containing the global flow of opium. Worse, every decade new variants of legalized opioids flooded an ever more globalized market. In America, half of the cases of drug addiction don't begin at a party or school, but with a doctor's prescription and the corresponding drug, opiate. Laboratory-created substances that bind to opioid receptors in the brain. Altogether, one can see the socioeconomic record of opioid misuse, widely documented as a loss of relationships, jobs, cars, houses, dignity, and sometimes even their children. Heroin production and trafficking continues to grow in Afghanistan, Iraq, Russia, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, northern India, and Nepal. The produce is often westbound. Within China, hundreds of laboratories manufacture derivatives of fentanyl and painkillers. Congressional Report 2018. Bound for Europe, Japan, America, and Australia. New addictive fentanyl analogs are linked to nations like Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. 95% of global heroin and morphine supply is monopolized between Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Laos, bound for India, Russia, Middle East, Africa, Europe, and North America. In India, Punjab ranks number 1 in heroin abuse. A recent study shows as many as 22.3% Indians are dependent on legal opioids. In a global context, the dispersion of a pathogen which was set free a long time ago has become totally independent of its devastating variants and consequences. Is opioid profiteering limitless like fossil fuels or precious metals and minerals? Then, regardless of the human impact, from an economic standpoint, it is uncontrollable. The imperial drug cartels that monopolized opium trade are all but gone. The ebb and flow of opioids throughout the world is worth billions of dollars, coordinated via thousands of supply lines with millions of people, based in many nations. We find opium at the origins of some of the world's biggest corporations, several of America's most powerful families and institutions. Smoke and Ashes by Amitabh Ghosh. Regardless, about 90 million people struggle with the addictive effects of opioids and roughly 120,000 who die of opioid overdose every year. INCB 2022. Human agency of this kind can also be seen as depravity, one which appears to be built into a globalized world as medicated or high to get by. Human interaction with opium and all its analogous versions represent limitless wealth acquisition and powerful new addictions, but at a tremendous cost, all the while undermining human beings, societies, and nations alike. Referred books. 1. Smoke and Ashes by Amitabh Ghosh. 2. The Empire of Pain by Patrick Keefe. 3. National Library of Medicine 2022 Sacklers sacked, but Purdue still caused opioid epidemic. 4. The Social Life of Opium in China, Cambridge University Press. 5. The Opium Business by Peter Thilly. 6. The Struggle for Control of the China Trade, E. H. Pritchard. 7. History of the Opium Problem by Hans Dirks.